It is usually said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and some of those intentions must have almost certainly been laid down by John DeLorean, a man with an admiral from rags to riches story as he went from being the son of Romanian and Hungarian immigrants to building his multi-million-dollar car company. This is a story of relative success which, unfortunately, led to the creation of the most disappointing car in history, the DMC-12, and later to a downfall and bankruptcy of the company bearing its founder's name, DeLorean. How does someone go from growing up in a poor family to becoming a car company tycoon? John DeLorean was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, a mecca within the US in everything car related, and it was there in Motor City where he received a scholarship to major in industrial engineering at Lawrence Tech. Being drafted to fight in the Second World War may have temporarily halted his studies, but nonetheless, he ended up graduating with honors in 1948. A few years later, DeLorean began working at Packard, where his improvements to the company's automatic transmission, among other developments, made him quickly be promoted to Chief of R&D soon after turning 30. It was from here that DeLorean's career really took off, as he became second in line at Pontiac's engineering department. Here, he became one of the project leaders behind what is probably this General Motors sub-brand's most iconic car, the GTO. Within GM, he was transferred from Pontiac to Chevrolet and appointed as the president of the brand, now with a yearly salary of over $3 million of today's dollars. DeLorean had a very cavalier attitude, a stark contrast with that of other executives in the industry. He was seen as somewhat of a rebel by his peers, with a demeanor more like that of a rock star or celebrity than what someone could have expected of an automaker's president. Despite the fact that he wasn't liked by many of his colleagues for quote-unquote not taking matters seriously and at times being a bit impulsive, at Chevrolet, just like in his previous jobs, his results were outstanding. In the midst of the 1973 oil crisis, now as vice president of General Motors, he became very critical of certain decisions the board members were taking in respect to the group's lineup. He believed a car in a dealership should make the customer's eyes glisten and not merely be attracted to it because of generous rebates and financing offers. Eventually, DeLorean left GM, although it was never clear in what kind of terms he did so. While he claimed he resigned, some board members claimed he was fired. In any way, his departure had some perks. He was given a nice bonus and the rights to a Cadillac dealership franchise in Florida, although he was only 48 at the time. Quite far from the age one would expect an executive to retire. It was during this time, while moving inventories filled with underpowered, front-wheel drive Eldorados, that he came up with the idea that became one of the best-known failures in automotive history. If everyone was churning out boring snoozmobiles, then surely there should be a market for something a bit more interesting. And if no one was building it, then why not do it himself? And so, the DeLorean brand and the DMC's development began. By now it's 1976 and DeLorean had set a pretty high bar. He was to build the best sports car ever built. Those weren't empty words. DeLorean had invested almost all his fortune into the project and he had gotten some pretty large banks and Hollywood stars to invest. On top of all this was DeLorean's resume, who not only clearly had more than some idea of how the car making business ran, but he also had been an excellent designer who understood perfectly the industrial processes behind building such a machine. This was the mind behind the Pontiac GTO after all. Nothing could go wrong, or so people thought. DeLorean's spec sheet for his project was impressive. He was going to create a mid-engine car designed by the great Giorgetto Giugiaro himself, on an ultralight tubular chassis on top of which stainless steel panels would be placed to make the bodywork. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, the car was going to be powered by a revolutionary rotary engine built completely in-house. This car was going to dominate over its rivals as it was going to be faster, lighter, and far less expensive. DeLorean presented that same year the first concept of what was to become the DMC-12, the DeLorean Safety Vehicle, or DSV. A car that seriously hyped everyone, the press included. Its design was simply stunning, with gull-wing doors adding a not-so-subtle touch. This was probably the best year for DeLorean, and from this time on, everything began to go downhill, fast. The first thing that had to go from the original design was the rotary engine, which was replaced by the not-so-special V6 the Mustang packed at the time. A pretty lackluster engine in its own right. The following year, they discovered another problem. DeLorean had bought the patents for a process called ERM, through which a foam made out of resin is pressed between two thin layers of fiberglass, creating a very light, albeit strong structure. However, it was proving to be near impossible to stick the stainless steel panels over this type of structure. On top of this, ERM turned out to be a very expensive process to use in car manufacturing. Starting to become desperate, DeLorean contacted Colin Chapman, Lotus's founder, to help him build a light chassis that would also work with stainless steel bodywork, and DeLorean was essentially handed a Lotus Esprit chassis and fiberglass body on top of which the American was to stick the steel panels. Yes, it was far cheaper, but it also created a new problem. By now, a car that was supposed to be light and nimble was going to be at least as heavy as a Ferrari 328 and quite a lot heavier than a Porsche 911, the cars that set the bar for what a sports car should be at the time. And when, at last, everything seemed said and done, a few more complications arose. The chosen Ford V6 engine would not fit into the DeLorean's new structure, which meant they quickly had to find an engine that did. A solution was found in the PRV, named after Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo, a 2.8-liter V6 engine that was used in cars such as the Peugeot 504. While the designers at DeLorean could easily extract 160 or 170 horsepower out of the Ford engine, the PRV was quite limited by its own reliability to 130 horsepower. Even then, this wasn't enough power and would place the DMC-12 as the least powered vehicle of its segment. The hastily placed French engine was mated to a 5-speed Renault Source gearbox that might as well have been made out of glass. And while the engine at least would now fit, it had to be placed behind the rear axle, ruining the perfect weight distribution DeLorean had dreamed of. There were also some issues that didn't stem from the car itself. John DeLorean had chosen Northern Ireland as a place to set up the factory to build the car based on the very tempting fiscal incentives the country offered for industries founded in high unemployment areas, something that DeLorean thought was a wonderful idea. However, as soon as the factory's construction was done and it became time to hire workers, managers, foremen, and engineering personnel, they realized that never before in Northern Ireland had cars been built, which made it absolutely impossible to find people who even had the most remote clue of how an automotive factory worked. Training people and training them well takes plenty of time and money, which not only made the car be further delayed, but also added some quality control problems that were certainly present in the first cars that rolled off the plant. Finally, and to add insult to injury, in 1981, when the car is to be released, a strong recession hits the United States, sending sports car sales tumbling down. By the time DeLorean hit showroom floors, it had an MSRP of the equivalent of $70,000 of today's dollars. About a 30% heftier price tag than originally intended for a car that was heavier, slower, less reliable, and less powerful than originally planned. At last, one of the most awaited vehicles of the 70s was here, but by now it was the wrong decade, and the car was no more than a silhouette of what it was expected to be. The press wasn't really thrilled this time, and the atrocious reviews soon started pouring in. Sales were dismal, leading the company to declare bankruptcy only 1 year later in 1982. Approximately 9,000 DeLoreans were built, although the exact figure is unknown. In true 80s fashion, a neighbor promised John DeLorean $17 million if he helped him conceal and ship a few containers filled with cocaine. The entrepreneur knew this was more than enough money to prolong his company's life and accepted the deal. Unfortunately for DeLorean, there was no cocaine, the whole operation being an attempt by his ex-convict neighbor and now FBI informant to reduce his prison sentence by incriminating someone. DeLorean was declared innocent on the grounds that he was induced by police to commit a crime he wouldn't otherwise have committed. He had no previous criminal record, and his dire financial situation was leading him to desperation. By this time, unfortunately, the scandal had long been made public and hadn't really helped to improve his brand's reputation. The dreams of DeLorean, along with the car that bare his name, were dead. He was finally vindicated in 1985 when the directors of what was to become Back to the Future set out to look for a car that was special enough for the movie, distinctive and modern at the same time. If one could pinpoint a defining feature that was well done in the production of DeLorean, it was certainly its design, and truth be told, if it's got a flux condenser in the back, the fact that it's unreliable and underpowered becomes secondary. Thus, the DeLorean became forever seared into people's memory as the iconic car of such an iconic movie, in some way giving John DeLorean and his creation the value and significance that he always dreamed of. DeLorean passed away in 2004, having seen his car go from big to failure to culture icon. Who knows, maybe in an alternate timeline, DeLorean's mark is still a resounding success. I hope you liked this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content on my channel. See you later!